The cold fluorescent lights of the morgue buzzed above me, casting an eerie glow over the sterile stainless steel tables. It was Halloween night, the one shift I dreaded every year. But money was money, and tonight was my turn to keep watch over the dead. The morgue was silent, the kind of silence that seemed almost alive, pressing down on me as I moved through the rows of covered bodies. I was alone, with only the gentle hum of the ventilation system and the distant ticking of the wall clock to keep me company. I tried to stay focused on my paperwork, but the stillness felt unnatural, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. Then came the first noise, a faint, muffled shuffling sound. I stopped, my pen hovering over the paper, listening intently. The sound was gone. I shook my head and forced a chuckle. It was probably just the building settling, I told myself. But a chill ran down my spine as I scanned the room, looking at the white sheets draped over motionless bodies. Trying to shake off the unease, I returned to my work, pretending I hadn't heard anything. Moments passed, and I began to feel the weight of exhaustion settling in. I leaned back, letting out a sigh, when a loud asterisk thud asterisk echoed from the other side of the room. My heart raced, and I stood up slowly, my eyes fixed on the rows of bodies. I swallowed hard and stepped closer, scanning the tables. All seemed normal. But then I noticed something, a white sheet at the far end, lying crumpled on the floor. My stomach clenched. I was sure I'd covered all the bodies earlier. I took a shaky step forward, each footfall echoing in the empty space. As I approached the fallen sheet, a metallic clink sounded behind me. I whipped around, my pulse quickening. The door to the refrigerated chamber was slightly ajar, a thick fog of icy air spilling out into the room. I'd locked that door when I came in. I was certain of it. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I reached for the door, pushing it shut with a trembling hand, the heavy thud echoing through the room. When I turned back, my breath caught in my throat. One of the bodies was sitting up. Its lifeless eyes stared straight at me, empty and hollow, as if peering into my very soul. I froze, unable to breathe, my heart hammering in my chest. The body suddenly slumped forward, collapsing back onto the table with a sickening asterisk crack asterisk. I backed away, my mind racing with questions. This wasn't possible. I had to be imagining things. But the grotesque sight was burned into my memory. Just as I took a step towards the exit, hoping to escape this nightmare, a cold hand gripped my ankle. I looked down, paralyzed by terror. Another body, pale and rigid, was clutching my leg, its fingers wrapped around me with a strength that felt anything but lifeless. I tried to pull away, but its grip tightened, dragging me down towards the floor. In the midst of my struggle, I caught a glimpse of something carved into its chest, a single word etched into the dead flesh. I leaned closer, the letters becoming clearer through my mounting panic. They spelled out a name, one I recognized from an old file I'd processed weeks ago. But that person had been buried, hadn't they? Before I could make sense of it, the grip released, and the room fell silent once more. I scrambled to my feet, desperate to escape, but I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. Someone or something was here, using these bodies for a purpose I couldn't yet understand. But I would find out. I had to. Because whatever this spirit was, it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. And somehow I had the sinking feeling that I was next on its list. The morgue seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I staggered back to my desk, clutching my trembling hands together, hoping to steady myself. I kept glancing at the cold steel tables, half expecting the bodies to sit up again, to reach out and drag me into the depths of whatever twisted hell had taken hold of this place. I grabbed my flashlight from the desk drawer and moved cautiously down the dimly lit corridor that led to the old archives. Maybe there was something there, a clue, a sign, anything that could explain what was happening. My gut told me that whatever force was at work here, it had something to do with that name carved into the body. The name that even now echoed in my mind like a curse. The archives were dark, the only light coming from my shaky flashlight beam. Rows upon rows of yellowing files and rusted cabinets stretched out before me. I started rifling through the records, pulling out files at random, hoping one of them would hold the answers I was looking for. I found the file I was searching for, an old case from nearly 2 decades ago. A young woman whose name matched the one I'd seen carved into the chest of that corpse. Her death had been ruled an accident. Drowning. But as I flipped through the pages, a chill crawled up my spine. The details didn't add up. She had been found in a river, but there were signs of bruising around her wrists and ankles. The autopsy report had been vague, almost evasive, as if someone had wanted to cover up the truth. A loud crash from the main room jolted me from my thoughts. I clutched the file tightly, almost tearing it as I sprinted back. The room was a chaotic mess. Bodies lay strewn across the floor, sheets tangled, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. One of the tables had been overturned, and the body that had been lying there was gone. I moved slowly, cautiously through the room, my flashlight revealing grotesque scenes that made my stomach churn. One body lay sprawled across the floor, its face contorted into an expression of pure terror, as if it had witnessed something too horrifying to comprehend. I tried to back away, but my heel struck something soft. I spun around, the light falling on another corpse, its eyes wide open and staring straight at me, its mouth twisted into a grimace that seemed almost accusatory. The room filled with a sudden piercing scream, a sound so shrill it felt like it was slicing through my brain. I clamped my hands over my ears, stumbling back, but the scream grew louder, more intense until it was all I could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I was panting, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then I heard it, a voice, faint but clear, whispering my name. I turned around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, searching for the source. But there was nothing there. Just the bodies, cold and still. The voice came again, closer this time, a sinister whisper that seemed to curl around my mind, wrapping me in a suffocating grip. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But my feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the very floor was holding me captive. I tried to focus, to remember why I was here, what I was looking for. The file, the woman in the file. I needed to understand what had happened to her, why her spirit was haunting this place. I forced myself to move, to shuffle towards the exit, clutching the file like a lifeline. But as I reached the door, it slammed shut, trapping me inside. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the walls seemed to swallow my voice. Then from behind me, I heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the room. I turned, my back pressed against the door, my flashlight barely illuminating the far side of the room. And then I saw it. One of the corpses was standing, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes fixed on me with a hollow, empty stare. Its lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but the intent was clear. It was coming for me. I knew then that I was trapped, at the mercy of a spirit that was far from finished with its revenge. And as the corpse took its first staggering step towards me, I realized with bone-chilling certainty that it wouldn't stop until it had taken what it wanted. And what it wanted was me. The corpse advanced slowly, its limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm that sent chills down my spine. I felt the walls closing in, my back pressed so tightly against the door that it ached. I tried the handle again, pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The body staggered closer, its hollow eyes fixed on me with a vacant stare. I could hear its bones creaking, the sickening squelch of flesh and sinew as it moved. A guttural groan escaped its lips, a sound that resonated through the room, echoing off the walls like a dreadful symphony of decay. I glanced around, desperate for anything I could use to defend myself. My flashlight was my only weapon, a flimsy piece of plastic that felt useless in my hand. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The morgue was small, and every inch of it seemed filled with the stench of death, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. The corpse was only a few steps away now. Its mouth hung open, slack and grotesque, as if it was ready to devour me whole. I raised the flashlight, prepared to swing, but before I could strike, the corpse stopped. It tilted its head as if listening to something I couldn't hear, and then with a sudden jerk, it crumpled to the floor. For a moment, the room was silent again, but the tension was thick, heavy, pressing down on me like a weight I could barely stand. I tried to catch my breath, my heart still racing, my skin crawling with a fear I couldn't shake. Just as I took a step back, I heard it again, a faint whisper, drifting through the room like a ghostly breeze. It was the same voice as before, calling my name, but this time it was louder, angrier, filled with a venom that seemed to seep into my very bones. I felt something cold brush against my neck, and I whipped around, but there was no one there. Only shadows flickering in the dim light, dancing like phantoms on the walls. The door behind me clicked open, creaking slowly as if inviting me to leave. I stumbled through, slamming it shut behind me and locking it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. I took a step back, relief flooding over me, but as I turned to leave, a new horror awaited. The hallway was lined with bodies. They stood against the walls, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish, their eyes wide and unseeing. I realized then that the spirit wasn't just haunting the morgue. It had infected the entire building, twisting it into its own personal purgatory. Each corpse bore marks, bruises, cuts, strange symbols carved into their flesh. And each one seemed to be watching me, silently accusing, as if I were somehow responsible for their suffering. I forced myself to move, to walk past them, my steps slow and measured. The hallway stretched on forever, the shadows thickening, warping until they seemed almost alive. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look at the corpses, but I could feel them watching me, their gaze burning into my back like hot coals. Then I heard it, footsteps echoing behind me. I turned, and to my horror, the bodies were moving, shambling down the hall in a grotesque procession. Their movements were slow but relentless, their dead eyes fixed on me, empty and accusing. I quickened my pace, but the hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, an infinite corridor of death and decay. As I rounded a corner, I spotted an old door at the end of the hall, its paint peeling, the wood warped and rotting. I sprinted towards it, my only hope of escape. I threw the door open and stumbled into the room beyond, slamming it shut behind me. I pressed my back against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was small, barely more than a closet, but it felt like a sanctuary. I fumbled in the darkness, searching for a light switch, and when I found it, a dim bulb flickered to life above me. The walls were covered in old photographs, yellowed with age, their edges curling. I squinted at them, my heart pounding as I realized what I was seeing. The photos were of the morgue, but not as I knew it. They were old, decades old, showing scenes of autopsies, of bodies lined up like grotesque mannequins. And in each photo I recognized a face, the woman from the file, the one whose name had been carved into that body. She was there, in every picture, her expression growing more hollow, more lifeless, until, in the final photograph, she was lying on a steel table, her eyes staring blankly into the camera, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. My hand flew to my mouth, a wave of nausea washing over me. But before I could look away, the light flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but my fingers were numb, trembling. I could hear the footsteps again, drawing closer, louder, as if the walls themselves were alive with the sound of them. And then, just as I was about to scream, I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold and lifeless. A voice whispered in my ear, soft and venomous, filling me with a terror so profound it rooted me to the spot. "Why didn't you save me?" The voice lingered, seeping into my mind like a poison, a chilling accusation that froze me in place. I whipped around, my flashlight flickering as I tried to find the source of the voice, but there was only darkness. The hand on my shoulder had vanished, as if it were nothing more than a ghostly caress, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this room. I took a step back, pressing my back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing, trying to make sense of the horror that was unfolding around me. The photographs on the walls seemed to shift, the images warping and twisting in the dim light. I could see her face again, the woman from the file, but this time she wasn't lying on the table. She was standing in the corner of the room, her pale face barely visible, her eyes wide and empty. I felt a scream clawing at my throat, but I bit it back, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep my wits about me. Then she moved, stepping forward, her bare feet soundless on the cold floor. I could see the bruises around her wrists, the marks on her neck. She looked like she had been drowned, her skin pale and waterlogged, her hair hanging in damp, matted strands. She reached out a hand, her fingers curling in the air as if beckoning me to come closer, to join her in the darkness. I turned to run, but the door behind me was gone. The walls had shifted, trapping me inside this suffocating room. I could feel the cold creeping up my spine, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I was trapped, with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide from the specter that had taken root in this place. The room seemed to pulse, the shadows growing darker, more sinister until I could barely see her through the murky gloom. I fumbled with my flashlight, but the beam was weak, barely enough to cut through the darkness. I aimed it at her, hoping to drive her back, but she only smiled, a chilling, hollow smile that sent a shiver down my spine. And then, in an instant, she was gone. The room was empty, the shadows retreating, leaving me alone with the echoes of my own breathing. I sank to the floor, my heart pounding, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What did she want from me? Why was she haunting this place, tormenting me with her presence? I glanced around, searching for any clue, any hint that could help me understand. My gaze fell on the file, lying open on the floor beside me. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the pages. There was something there, a detail I hadn't noticed before, something hidden in the margins, a single word scrawled in faded ink. Asterisk revenge. Asterisk. I felt a chill wash over me as the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a vendetta, a twisted plot for retribution that had been set in motion long before I ever set foot in this morgue. The woman had been wronged, betrayed, and now she was using me to settle the score, to exact her vengeance on those who had failed her in life. I could hear the footsteps again, louder this time, echoing through the walls, surrounding me, closing in from all sides. I knew I couldn't stay here. that I had to find a way out before she claimed me as her next victim. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of an escape. And then I saw it, a faint glimmer of light, barely visible, seeping through a crack in the wall. I moved towards it, pushing against the crumbling plaster, tearing at the wall with my bare hands until the crack widened, revealing a hidden passage, a narrow tunnel that led into the darkness beyond. I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the tunnel, the walls pressing close around me, the air thick with the stench of decay. The light from my flashlight flickered, threatening to die, but I pressed on, desperate to escape, to leave this nightmare behind. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a winding maze of darkness and rot. I could hear the sound of the footsteps behind me, growing louder, closer, as if she were following me, chasing me through the twisting corridors of the morgue's forgotten depths. I quickened my pace, my heart racing, my lungs burning as I pushed myself to keep moving. Finally, I saw a faint light ahead, a glimmer of hope in the suffocating blackness. I stumbled towards it, my legs heavy, my body numb with fear and exhaustion. As I emerged from the tunnel, I found myself in a small, windowless room, the walls lined with shelves of dusty jars and cracked medical instruments. In the center of the room was a single steel table, stained and rusted, a gruesome reminder of the horrors that had taken place here. I moved towards it, drawn by a sickening curiosity, unable to look away from the grotesque scene before me. And then I saw her, lying on the table, her body broken and lifeless, her eyes staring up at the ceiling with that same vacant, accusing stare. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the truth, a terrible, gut-wrenching truth that twisted my insides and made my skin crawl. She had never left. She had been here all along, waiting, watching, haunting the very place that had taken her life. And now she had claimed me as her own, trapping me in this purgatory of death and decay, bound to the morgue by the weight of her unfinished vengeance. I turned to run, but the door had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall of cold, unyielding steel. I was trapped, alone with the ghosts of the past, the specters of a vengeance that would never rest, never fade, never die. As I stood there, feeling trapped and defeated, a sudden warmth flooded the room. The cold, suffocating grip of despair started to melt away, and I felt a strange but gentle presence envelop me. It was as if the air had changed, filling with a lightness that wasn't there before. I looked around, and for the first time I noticed a faint glow emanating from the walls, like a soft golden light breaking through the darkness. In the center of the room, where her body had been moments before, stood the spirit of the woman I had been haunted by. But she looked different now, peaceful, almost radiant, her eyes filled with an unexpected kindness. She was no longer the vengeful apparition that had pursued me. She seemed like a woman released from a terrible burden. She smiled, and in that smile I saw a glimpse of the person she once was, free from the pain and anger that had bound her to this place. The warmth in the room grew, and I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. I turned, half expecting to find myself facing another ghost, but instead I saw a vision of light, a figure that felt more like a guardian than a specter. The figure reached out and touched the woman's shoulder, and I realized that she was no longer alone in her suffering. She had been found, seen, acknowledged, and now she was ready to let go. She looked at me, her eyes soft and filled with gratitude. In a voice like a whisper on the wind, she said, "Thank you for setting me free." I felt a tear slide down my cheek, moved by the peace that seemed to fill her. The room began to change, the oppressive shadows fading away, replaced by a warm, golden glow that seemed to wash over everything, cleansing it of the fear and darkness that had haunted this place. The walls shifted, revealing the door once again, wide open and beckoning me to leave. The spirit gave me one last look, a silent farewell before she slowly faded, her form dissolving into the light. I took a deep breath, my chest filling with a sense of relief and hope I hadn't felt in years. I stepped towards the door, pausing one last time to look back. The room was empty now, silent and still, but it no longer felt haunted. It felt peaceful, as if the weight of so many years had been lifted, the anguish released into the light. As I walked through the door and back into the hallway, I realized that I was no longer afraid. The morgue felt different, lighter, as if it too had been freed from the grip of the past. I knew I had played a part in helping her find peace, in letting her spirit finally rest. And in doing so, I felt as if a burden had lifted from me as well. I walked outside, breathing in the crisp night air, and looked up at the sky. The stars seemed to twinkle a little brighter, the world a little more alive, as if something beautiful had been restored. I knew that I would never forget what had happened, but I also knew that it had changed me for the better. I was no longer the same person who had walked into the morgue that night. As I made my way home, a calmness washed over me, filling me with a sense of purpose and renewal. I had witnessed something beyond explanation, something that had transformed both me and the spirit of the woman I had helped to free. And somehow, I knew that I had been given a gift, a reminder that even in the darkest places there could still be light, peace, and the possibility of redemption.